Shabbat Shalom. Happy Sabbath. This morning we are thankful again for Iyar's grace and for his love. Our subject today is a letter to the ignoble believers. A letter to the ignoble believers. Often we read in the New Testament where letters are sent by the apostles to the churches or the assemblies to put in context what needs to be done and those things that ought to be refrained from. Perhaps believers today are too sanguine in the temperament of their wealth and in pleasure to allow themselves to be daunted by the gloomy reminiscences of Pergamum, Thyatira, and indeed Sardis, and even more so, the reality of Laodicea, which we have to contend with in these last days. And so regarding that residual faith that people sometimes say they have, it is really a belief or an idea in search of a belief. Because in the magistrates of reasonableness, we know that we come short. And we need to do much better than we are doing. And so I ask myself the question, how often do we revere and adulate nostalgia? In the sense that you often hear people talk about what things were like back in the old times, how worship and church was vibrant and real back home, and how it is now. And I think it's exemplified very much in the church of Laodicea, that church is lukewarm and is about to be spewed out of Yeshua's mouth. And so we reflect on nostalgia and we look back into what life was like back in the New Testament times. And so today we want to look at that assembly we call Corinth. The church of Corinth and what it was like in those days when Paul and Silas and all the other apostles were journeying with the word. We want to look at that. So as such, I want you to turn with me to the book of Me'esh, which is the book of Acts, and chapter 17, Acts chapter 17. And it reads thus, starting from verse 1, and having passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a congregation of the Yehudim. There was a congregation of the Jews. And according to its practice, Shaul, that's Paul, went in unto them, and for 3 Sabbaths was reasoning with them from the scriptures. 3 consecutive Sabbaths, Paul went into their congregation and was reasoning with them from the scriptures, explaining and pointing out that Mashiach had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and that this is Amashiach, Yeshua, whom I proclaim to you. And some of them believed, and a large number of the worshiping Yahwehnites, that's the Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Shaul and Sila, but the Yehudim who did not believe, having become envious, took some of the wicked men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, disturbed all the city, and came upon the house of Jason, in the English it's Jason, and were looking to bring them out to the people. But not finding them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers to the city rulers, crying out, "They who have turned the world upside down have come here too, whom Jason had received, and all of them are acting contrary to the dogmas of Caesar, that's Caesar, saying there is another sovereign, Yeshua." And they troubled the crowd and the city rulers when they heard this, and when they had received the pledge from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Verse 10, and the brothers immediately sent Shaul and Sila away by night to Berea, who having come went into the congregation of the Yehudim. This is the word of Iyar. So Luke here, Dr. Luke, writes that Saul was in that place of Thessalonica. And the truth that he brought had disturbed the comforted, but it comforted the disturbed. Truth has always been an offense to those who don't want to hear it. And it was no different back then how it was. It says that when Paul and Silas preached the word, they cried out, saying, "These men are turning the world upside down." And that statement intrigued me in the sense that we know that Adam was created upright, but thereafter all men were born upside down. We come into the world head first. And perhaps that's an appropriate position for the baby inside the uterus when to be delivered to that cephalic presentation is head first. We all come into the world head first, upside down, and thereafter we learn to walk the right way up. And so I find it ironic that they would say truth was turning the world upside down. But what they were saying was more than that. They were not saying that these men were rowdy. No, they were not saying that. It was an idiomatic expression accusing them of sedition. The very same charge that they had leveled at Yeshua, saying that he claims to be a king, and the only king that we know is Caesar. And so the whole city was in uproar. Verse 5 of chapter 24 of Acts says, "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition." There's a charge among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. We found him. The truth that he brings, the word that he preaches, has become a pestilent to the people. And the word said that it stirred and shook the people. He was upsetting them. And truth has always done that. Some will love the truth and some will hate it. It cannot be any other way. It's almost inevitable that when you bring truth, some people will love it and some will dislike it. It shook them. They were shaken. And it reminds me very much of Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming, as you know, is that writer, the fictional writer of the British Secret Service, an agent called James Bond. And those of you who have watched James Bond, you will see at times when Bond himself will declare that he likes his martini cocktail shaken but not stirred. And it's interesting that that statement was first used in the one of the early Bond film called Dr. No. And I believe we have many Dr. No's today. The Dr. No's of our age are the people who are saying no to the truth. When you tell people that the Sabbath ought to be kept, and they say no, they're a Dr. No. When you tell them that the feast days ought to be kept, and they say no, these are the Dr. No's. They don't want to be stirred, even though they are shaken. They are like that. And I think Ian Fleming really was onto something when he said, "You only live twice." That's another Bond movie. You only live twice. What was he saying? You know, if you're born once, you will die twice. But if you born twice, you will only die once. He's onto something, that Mr. Goldfinger. He said diamonds are forever, but we will say truth is forever. And so what Paul and Silas was doing was not only shaking the people, the word says all that can be shaken will be shaken in the last day. They were stirred. Stirred. Today, you know, when you speak the truth to people, because truth is exclusive, and it has long been an irritant to those who care not to hear it. Often when we give truth to people, some become hostile, as they did with Paul. And others, they retreat into what I would call a dignified kind of sulk. That's what people do when they hear truth, because it makes them want to look at themselves and perhaps make a decision against the lifestyle that they're living. And so here, Paul in Thessalonica is preaching, and the people said he is turning the world upside down. And if we ought to use that as a statement to evaluate ourselves, we must ask, in relation to our own calling, how are we doing? Are we creating that kind of shaking? Are we creating that kind of uproar in the cities and the towns and the communities in which we live? Are we turning the world upside down? Or are we walking in the same upside down world as the people? Are we doing that? And they sought to kill Paul. Oh, yes. They sought to kill him. And the word tells us that he moved on to Berea, where it is said of the Berean, these were more noble. Our subject is speaking to the ignoble believers. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica. Remember, the Jews were trying to kill Paul in Thessalonica. They followed him to Berea and later on to Corinthians, to the city of Corinth. And this morning we want to look at the ignoble church. Because when we read in the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and 3, we see 7 listed assemblies, each of which represents the different era or epoch of the church. And the church has always been singular. And so it is quite strange and asinine, to be quite honest, when you hear people say that I belong to that church and the other church. Oh, I'm a Baptist. Oh, I'm a Pentecostal. Oh, I'm a Catholic. Oh, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. That's not the teaching of the word. It's not the teaching. Yeshua has one assembly, and all others should be members of that one assembly that is in the book of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 23. You're members of that. Not a church all by yourself. And I think that's one of the great deceptions that we have to contend with in our world. If you are in Yeshua, you are told that you are Abraham's seed, according to Galatians 3 and verse 29. And if you are Abraham's seed, then according to what Yeshua said, you must do even as Abraham did. What did Abraham do? Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and went towards that promised land. And that's the message that the apostle Paul was preaching. So let's look at that focus this morning. Let's use Corinth, the city that located there in Greek province, but at this time it was under the leadership or the guidance of Rome. So we're talking about a Greco-Roman culture. That's what we're dealing with when we're talking about Corinth. What was Corinth like? There were really 2 different Corinth. There was an ancient Corinth that was really very paganistic. It had many different gods that the people worshiped. It had a temple there that had well over 2,000 priestesses in that city, and worship was a little bit different than it is today, because in those days people would simply go to the temple and they would have intercourse with the priest. That's what was happening in the city of Corinth. Oh yes, that's what happened over there. They were such that they worshiped Aphrodite. That was what was happening in this Greek province temple. As you well know, in Greek mythology, Hermaphroditus was a child of Aphrodite and Hermes. Did you get me? I said Hermaphroditus was a child of Aphrodite and Hermes, a kind of unisex. Are you with me? According to Ovid, that is, was born a remarkable handsome, of whom Naiad Salmaces attempted to rape and prayed to be united with forever. And so that child become what? Aphrodite, whom they worship. They worship. And so we're talking here that was happening in the city of Corinth, sacred prostitution, temple prostitution, cult prostitution, and religious prostitution. These were part of the system in Corinth. And Paul found himself in a position having to establish an assembly in this kind of culture. Are you with me? And I've always said and still believe that whatever the families are, such will be the church. If you want to improve your church, improve the families, their way of life, the way they live. Because the churches are made up of the families. And so you have a culture where people were worshiping other gods, idols. One of the problems they have was how, do you separate yourself from people who eat food that are offered to idols? That still goes on today. Many of these things, people say are offered to certain people. They have to be prayed over by certain ritual priests, and we go to supermarkets and we purchase this thing. So consider yourself living in Corinth, and an assembly, a new assembly is established. But that assembly is having to draw from the culture to bring people into the new assembly. And so you understand the problems that Shaul had with the church of Corinth, because they were mostly drawn from that culture. And so let's go into the word. Join me in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Shaul, a called emissary of Yeshua HaMashiach by the desire of Elohim, and brother Sosthenes, to the assembly of Elohim, which is in Corinthos, to those who are Kodesh, that's holy, in the Mashiach, HaMashiach, called Kodeshim, with all those calling on the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, our Adon. In every place there is an hour. Favor to you and the peace from Yeshua, our Yahweh, our Father, and Adon, Yeshua HaMashiach. And Paul is writing to the Corinthian people, this church that is housing a lot of ignoble believers. They had written to Paul for direction to see how they should walk and how they should conduct their affairs. But Paul also heard from the household, one of the members called Chloe, what was going on. They didn't tell that to Paul, but Paul heard from another member. Some would call that talebearing. But let's read it, because, people sometimes only tell you what they think you should hear. Paul here, and come with me to verse 10. Let's start from verse. And I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Adon, Yeshua HaMashiach, that you will agree, and that there be no divisions among you. So the church of Corinth, it was divided. And nothing divided can stand. Are you with me? There is division among you, but that you be knit together in the same mind and in the same opinion. Listen to what Paul is saying, and let's take his counsel seriously. He is writing to this church that has many problems. And we need to remember that the church had lost its first love way back in Ephesus. So we're now in Corinth. The church had lost its first love, and ever since it's downhill, going down, down, down. And of course, there was a little revival round about the church of brotherly love. That's the Philadelphian era. But then Laodicea came and swept that away. And Laodicea is now naked, wretched, blind, just can't see its own nakedness. So we have a problem. So the point I'm making, I'm juxtaposing Laodicea with the church of Corinth. And I see many similarities that are taking place, even now as people are promoting Aphrodite. Are you with me? We are unclear in our mind who is a man and who is a woman. We don't seem to know that, even though the word makes it very clear that Yah made a man and he made a woman, male and female. And he said it was not good for the man to be alone, therefore he should take a helpmeet, and he gave him a woman. We are not sure what that means anymore. That's in our world. And of course, this same Aphrodite was, in the counterpart of the Romish culture, that was Venus. Same thing we're dealing with. Today, we don't talk about Aphrodite in the same context, or we don't speak of Venus in the same context. We just say trans. And everybody knows what we mean by trans. But if we go back into this culture, we're talking Aphrodite. We need to understand. And it was that kind of thing that Paul was preaching about and was laying out the truth. He was leafing it out to the people, and they said to him, this man is turning our world upside down, when the world was already upside down. He was shaking them and stirring them, but they didn't want that. And they took him and they flogged him, and he had to escape because he had the truth and they had the lies. What's new? Someone said this morning in Sabbath school. Nothing new under the sun. Nothing at all. Verse 11, chapter 1, 1 Corinthians. Paul says, for I have been informed concerning you, my brothers, by those of Chloe, that there are strifes among you. They didn't tell Paul. But Paul said, one of the members among you told me, informed me, and Paul named the person. Sometimes we don't want to name. Paul said, brother so-and-so told me that there are strifes among you. Remember, this is the same Corinthian church that when the people went to Passover, you call it the Lord's Supper, some of them were drunk turning out. Can you imagine going to church to do Passover and you're drunk? Well, the Corinthian church was there. And there was also a young man who was living, an incestuous life with his mother-in-law in the Corinthian church. And today we see some of these things happening in the very assemblies that people we worship, and nothing is said. Paul said, you can't have it that way. And so he's letting them know, somebody other than the letter that you sent to me asking for instruction, somebody has told me other things that are happening that you did not report to me from the household of Chloe. Because the word says, does it not? He that cry and sigh, they will be spared. You see the abomination taking place, Ezekiel cried out, but you're not saying anything. You have slipped into what? A kind of sulk, a kind of silence that is so deafening, anyone can hear it. Let's read on. What I mean is this, that each one of you says, I am sure I am the Apollos, and I am Kepha, or I am Messiah. Understand where Paul is going with it. Paul is saying these people in the Corinthian church, even as today, they had favorite pastors. They would say, I'm going to hear Pastor so-and-so preach today. And another one would say, but I'm going to that church because I want to hear Pastor Blank preach. Oh, Pastor Jones is better than Pastor Blank. Paul says, is Yeshua divided? He wants to know. Has Amashiach been divided? Was Shaul, that's Shaul, was I the one who was impaled for you? Was I the one who was crucified for you? Was I the one who carried that patibulum that was nailed to the tree? Was it me? No, I plant and Apollos water, and the increase comes from Yeshua. Why then are you divided among the ministers? Why are you then divided among the churches, saying that church is better than that church and that pastor is better than that church? They are only postmen bringing messages to the people. Why? Paul says, I heard all this that you did not report to me, and it's happening among you. So I'm putting in my letter and I'm addressing you today, you ignoble. Are you with me? Verse 26, Paul says, for look at your calling, brothers, that there were not many wise. Not many wise among you at all. You're not wise, you're foolish. Now, if you speak like that to members in the church today, they would leave. But we ought not to tone it down because we are afraid of hurting people's what? Conscience. We spoke about conscience last week. He said there were not many wise among you, according to the flesh, and many mighty, not noble. It said there was not many noble among you. You were not like the Bereans who were noble. You are ignoble. That's what Paul is saying. That's our subject today. A letter to the ignoble believers. You've got to understand the context here of Corinth. As I indicated earlier, the old Corinth had been destroyed, and a new Corinth was built. These new people were ex-slaves in Corinth who had worked their way up, as people who come from all different parts of the world come to America, and you hear they say that this is the American dream. You can make a life for yourself in America better than anywhere. That's what they say. So Corinth was not only the dream of that part of the world, Greece, but it was also the Las Vegas of Greece. Very immoral, decadent. And it was from that source of people that were moving into the church, and they would bring their culture with them and the things that they practiced daily. And the immorality was all in that assembly. And the Apostle Paul had to address this. Oh, yes. You're coming from a temple, a church, a religion where it was okay to be intimate with the priest on worship morning. And then you come and somebody said you can't do that. That's Corinth. And Paul is letting us know that these ex-slaves who had built themselves, worked hard to build a life for themselves, they were now well off and had become smug. Hey, with me. downtown rebels had now moved up to Constant Spring, and they were different now in terms of their outlook on life, but they brought that into the church and they were snubbed. Many who come to America and come to Britain and make a life for themselves, a better life than they had previously, are now thinking, we have arrived. So it was in Corinth. Paul says, you were not born noble. Sometimes the noble are likely to be more humble because they're born into it. But when you get it and you develop and you have a little money now, you think you've arrived. Paul said, there are not many wise among you. Not wise. And Paul says, I cannot even address you as being spiritual. You're carnal. Fancy writing to someone, and in response, that's what they're saying to you. How would you feel? You see, truth was sent to purify us. Sanctify them by thy word. John 17:17. Thy word is truth. And so Paul is indeed turning the world upside down, having the people walk upright. But the people don't want to walk upright. And so they sought to kill him. In verse 22 of chapter 1, he says, and since Yehudim, the Jew, they asked for a sign, and the Yawanites, that's the Greek, they seek wisdom. Yet we proclaim Messiah impaled to the Yehudim a stumbling block, and to the Greek, it's foolishness. They want a sign. And to the Greek, it's foolishness, because the Greeks, they preferred philosophy. And that's why Paul found himself also in Athens. Athens is about 40 miles away from Corinth. And so they were competing. Corinth was also a port where sailors, frequent, and you know how sailors sometimes spend their money when they've been at sea all the time, and when they come into the port, and obviously they go to worship, you know what happens. That was what was happening in Corinth, and these are the kind of women that were going into the church at Corinth. And now you understand why Paul was saying, when they come into the church, let them keep silent. Let them go home and ask their husband things. Let them surrender themselves to their husband. They must keep silent in church. So we need to understand the context here. Paul said we can't have these women teaching in our churches. But Paul was saying. Not only that, when you read chapter 11 of Corinthians, Paul says they come in, and these women, like prostitutes, they don't cover themselves when they're praying or they're prophesying. They don't cover themselves. They bring the culture into the church because they're not only impudent, but they're ignoble. But I want to stir them up with the truth, even as we need to be stirred up with the truth of Yah. So Paul records that when a woman is praying, and when she's prophesying, and I don't mean prophesying even as a prophet would. Reading the word is prophesying. What do I mean? There are two kinds of prophet. There's a prophet that foretells, and there is a prophet that tells forth. In the New Testament, you have more prophets who tell forth than you have, tell forth than foretells. So we need to understand that. So when you're praying and you're prophesying, Paul says, those women who you see there, these rebel rousers, who are used to that Greco Roman culture who have come into the church, when they come in, don't allow them to teach. Let them be silent. Because, we talk about feminism now. It was right then. You have 2,000 priestesses in one assembly? I don't understand that. That's the church of Corinth. Paul says, not many of you were noble. Let's read on. Chapter 1, 27, verse 27. But Elohim has chosen the foolish of the world to put to shame the wise. And Elohim has chosen the weak of the world to put to shame the strong. And Elohim has chosen the lowborn of the world and the despised and the ones that are not, that he might bring to naught the ones that are, so that no flesh should boast in his presence. No flesh at all should boast in his presence. So Paul is addressing them. Because Paul wants to point them into a new direction so that they can see beyond the insular confines of their own religion and that which they have long since practiced. Because Paul says in chapter 2 and verse 9, but as it has been written, eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, nor have entered into the heart of man what Elohim has prepared for those who love him. Paul wants us to know that. He says you're glorying in your filth right now. You're living in the mud by way of your lifestyle. But there is something far beyond your vision that you cannot see. Eyes have not seen it, and ears have not heard it, but believe it by the word. You see, when a person says they're a believer, what do they really mean? Because in James 2:19, James says that demons believe and tremble. So when a person says, I believe, James wants you to know, you know better than the demons at that stage. The difference between you and the demon, then, there must be a corresponding action to your belief. It must be attended by action. And James go on to tell you. So you say, Iyar is one. You've done well, James says. But demons believe the same thing. They know that Iyar is one. And then James says, show me your claim, your faith, and I'll show you works. Many are no better than being a church attender. They don't practice truth. They only speak truth. But we must understand that our spoken theology must be consistent with our lived faith. It must be. And that's what Paul is here addressing in the Corinthian church. Come with me to chapter 3 of the same book. And I, brothers, was not able to speak to you as to spiritual ones, but as fleshly, carnal, as the children in Mashiach. I fed you with milk. Are you with me? Paul is writing a letter to the ignoble church. He said, you are not noble. You're rebels. He said, I couldn't teach you hard truth. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it, and even now you are still not able, for you are still fleshly. For since there is envy and strife and divisions among you, are you not fleshly and walking according to man? The church where you're worshiping, do you see any of these? Paul says, if you do, you're still carnal. For when one says, I am Shaul, and another, I am Apollos, are you not fleshly? You're carnal. When you're saying, I prefer that pastor over that pastor, or that church over that pastor, when Yeshua is unified, and let me show you the divisions very clearly. Yeshua says, he sent out the disciples, and he said, go and teach all nations that I have commanded you. Teach them the Sabbath, teach them the feast days. They went out and they taught. The churches then said, we will keep the first day of the week, and we won't keep the feast days at all. In fact, we'll give him Christmas, and we'll give him Easter. We'll give him all kinds of different pagan religion. Paul says, you're still in milk. You still need crushed potatoes. You can't eat solid food because you're still in a state of ignorance. And so we have a society where Solomon would have you believe in chapter 10 and verse 7, Ecclesiastes, he says, I have seen servants upon horses and princes walking as servants upon the earth. Are you with me? These men, these ex-slaves that have worked themselves up in Corinth, who were not noble at all. They were not of noble birth. They wallowed in the filth. They were now doing well, and Paul, wants us to know that these were as servants now were riding horses, but princes were walking as servants. Are you with me? The point I'm making, and I'm drumming home, is sometimes when we do well, we get all high and mighty and look down on other people. Now that we're riding horses, we're not walking as we used to, I mean barefoot. But the man who is cultured, the man who is in his upbringing is aristocratic, if you want, in a spiritual sense, he's humble. And you see that with the conversations that Yeshua had with his disciples. He's about to go to Jerusalem to suffer many things. And he's letting them know that I have to go to Jerusalem to suffer many things so I can redeem you. And what was taking place among them? They wanted to know, well, who is the greatest among us? And as for the sons of Zebedee, they brought their mother and asked the question, Messiah, when you come into your kingdom, when you establish the kingdom, can one of my sons sit on your right and another sit on the left? Don't leave any room for anybody else. Just them. Let them be Chancellor of the Exchequer and Deputy Prime Minister. Yeshua said, do you know what you're asking? He was telling them the priority is, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things. They say, who is going to be the greatest among us? Who? And so they didn't get it at all. Even many of us today are not getting it. And so I would like for you to join me in the book of John, John chapter 21. John chapter 21. Because the word here has instruction for us. After these things, Yeshua showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. On this wise showed himself he. There were together Simon and Peter and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said unto them, I'm going fishing. They say unto him, we also go with thee. They went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. What does the word say? They caught nothing. These are men, professional men, fishers of men, to be, but not yet. They went fishing and they caught nothing. Their whole livelihood depended on this. No fish, no money, family is in need. All of them went, but they fished all night, and the word said they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Yeshua stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Yeshua. Oh, ironic. Even after 2,000 years, we read the word of Yah, and many of us still don't even know who he is and what he requires from us, how to worship him, where his name is placed. Did I say name? Yes, I said name, because some of us still don't know his name. We still call him Lord, even as we do the British barons. We call him Jesus, even as he tells us in Hosea, don't call me Baal, don't call me that name, because my name Yahweh or Yahweh is for all generation of people. Don't call me Baal. So we don't know him, even as the disciples did not know that it was him. They went fishing all night and they caught nothing. Verse 5, then Yeshua said unto them, children, have ye any meat? They answered him, no. And he said unto them, cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. Now this intrigues me greatly. Why? Peter and the rest of these men have been doing this for years. This is how they live. This is how they live. And Yeshua emerges out of a situation and then tell them to cast their net on the other side. Go deeper. That kind of truth that you had once preached, that was okay, indicating again for emphasis that Yeshua told his disciples to cast the net on the other side of the ship, and the word says they found. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Therefore that disciples whom Yeshua loved said unto Peter, it is Yah, it is Yeshua. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was Yeshua, he girt his fish's coat unto him, and he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, for they were not far from land, but it was 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. As soon as they were come to land, they saw a fire of coal there, and fish there lay thereon, and bread. Oh, yes. So, as we studied that after Yeshua told them to cast the net on the right side, Peter was in effect saying, Master, we have been at this all night, and we have not caught anything, but I'm doing this because you said it. I'm going against what I believe, because all of us here are men who have used to fishing, and all night we have toiled and we've caught nothing, but nevertheless I'm doing it because you say so. After all, you are the one who made all the fish and the ocean. And after he did that, you would have thought Peter's response would have been different. Peter is in business with all these, well, some of the apostles. And perhaps Yeshua, now his friend, if he could just come every so often and do what he did then, they would have a lively business. But Peter said, get away from me, Master. Why? He tells you why. He said, I am a sinful man. And so we get the message here. Who are the people who want to stay away from Yeshua? Sinful people. Who are the people who reject the truth? Sinful people, the Dr. Knows of this world. And so, having addressed this congregation, Paul gives us a beautiful picture of what it should look like. And let's close on this. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not love, I have become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all, so that I could remove mountains and have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it is of no avail. Charity suffereth long and is kind. These are all the things that the Corinthian church lacked. These are all the things that the Laodicean church wished it had. Doth not behave unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. Church, this is for us, all of us. So Paul was letting us know that the church of Corinth did not have love. So he says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, now I know in part, And then shall I know even as I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. May we understand that. May we ensure that we love not only Yeshua, but our neighbors as he has commanded us to do. In Yeshua's name I pray. Amen.